This podcast was recorded during the 2023 WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes. Without the labor of the writers and actors currently on strike, the television and movies being covered here would not exist. We stand with the writers and actors and support their call for equitable and fair treatment for everyone in the industry. You can support those on strike by making a donation at entertainmentcommunityfund.org, which will go to a writer, actor, or other entertainment worker in need.
You're listening to ThunderQuack Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome back to ThunderQuack Perfect 10. I'm your host, Michael Cohen. Every episode, we dive deep with a special guest into a piece of pop culture they adore. Is it a 10 out of 10? Maybe, but to them, it's an undeniable masterpiece. So sit back, get comfy, and let's find some joy talking William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet with Amanda Konkin. Amanda,
Hi.
It has been a little while since we've podcasted together.
It has. It's been a very long while since we've podcasted, which is kind of nice. It's nice to be back.
and people who have found me through Perfect 10 would have absolutely no context because
no idea who I am.
Yeah, because you've never been on this show before. So Amanda and I podcasted for a very long time together for all what is it 7 or 8 seasons of Arrow? I can never remember. I think it's
I feel like it
7?
was 8.
Is it 8?
It was 8. It was like 7.5, right?
Yeah,
the last one was like a shorter one. Well, I feel like we podcasted for 8 years, so I don't know if that maybe it overlapped in for 8 seasons.
And then we continued for a little while after that with the ThunderQuack podcast. So I mean, all of that stuff is out there online for people who want to go back and listen to it, but I don't know why you would. The ThunderQuack podcast has some really great episodes in it, but I don't know why anybody would want to go back and listen to Quiver at this point.
We're delightful, Mike. We're delightful.
You'd have to want to subject yourself to Arrow, which like the first 2 seasons, yeah, absolutely, because the first 2 seasons are fantastic, but
so go do that.
The mileage varies on the rest of that series. So, but we were there for the whole thing. But
and I just want to I want to make sure I came to the right podcast, because I feel like you said that we're podcasting about William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, but it's Baz Luhrmann's William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah,
right?
so okay. it is directed by Baz Luhrmann, but it is technically the name of the film is William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Romeo plus Juliet. You have to use the plus symbol instead of and.
Okay, that's fair.
To be technically correct. Let's not keep anybody waiting. Let's get right into it. So for those who don't know, I'm gonna give you guys the rundown on William Shakespeare's, Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so let's set the stage. The year is 1996. The setting is a vibrant, chaotic Verona beach, and the players are 2 star-crossed lovers from feuding families. And no, these are not the Capulets and Montagues that you would be used to, but rather a modern retelling in a world where swords are branded handguns and Shakespearean prose meets the MTV era. Directed by the avant-garde Baz Luhrmann, William Shakespeare's Romeo plus Juliet propelled young Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes to superstardom as they embodied the tragic lovers in a way we'd never seen before. This isn't your English class's Romeo and Juliet. It's a whirlwind of passion, vibrant visuals, and a rock and roll. I call it more of a pop soundtrack, but that's all right. But amid all its wild stylizations, at its heart remains a timeless tale of love and woe. Whether you were captivated by the contemporary backdrop or simply swept up in the poetry of it all, today we're digging into the audacious and undeniably iconic William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. So let's get into some Billy Shakes action with this one.
Billy Shakes.
I
I love it.
this is to give everybody the additional background that I think is very important. If they haven't listened to a whole bunch of ThunderQuack, Amanda and I are huge, massive, ridiculous Shakespeare nerds. Um,
It's how we became friends
exactly.
because our small town didn't have much, but while we were in high school, they started a Shakespeare festival, and I will say not actually in our town, but in the town that was, like,
Next to
even
us.
smaller and close to
Yeah.
us. But it was and that was where we met, so we didn't go to the same school, but we met at a Shakespeare festival, and then when we did go to the same school, we were like, "Hey, you like Shakespeare?" So,
Yeah. So
I don't know if I told that story correctly, but
no, that's totally it. Yeah. So it is literally in the origins of our friendship, which is I think what made it an appropriate choice. We went back and forth, like we sort of went around on a few different options for what we could do for this episode, and we almost landed on Pride and Prejudice, but I think it was just I don't
yeah,
have
you
enough
just don't know
familiarity,
enough. You
right?
don't know enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So
I was like, if I have to choose a secondary piece of favorite media, it would be Shakespeare in general.
yeah,
Because I do
yeah.
the other context is like oh my goodness. I forget how much of a Shakespeare nerd I am until people talk about it. Like I literally made a web series about William Shakespeare. Not
Yeah.
like about Shakespeare plays, but about the author William Shakespeare, like the
Yeah.
playwright. Like I like his whole history in life. It was so fun. So oh my goodness. I can't believe that I haven't thought about that in a hot minute too.
Yeah, well,
So,
why don't you plug it? Why don't you tell everybody what it's called so they can go find it on
oh,
YouTube?
I sure can. Oh my goodness. So it's called Blank Verse, and it is about William Shakespeare as a modern day university student. And we produced it over the course of a couple months, and we released an episode a week for like 4 months. And it was really fun. It was with a whole bunch of people at a UBC that I'd gone to, University of British Columbia, who were all theater nerds just like me. And I, at the time, was really trying to be a producer. And I was like, well, I'm going to hire writers, I'm going to hire directors, and we're going to make it. And we basically did it in 5 acts. So there's 5 acts with four like shorts in each of them. It's about 2.5 hours worth of content in total. And it follows basically the life of William Shakespeare through his plays as if university inspired him to write his plays. It was so much fun to do. And the characters in the show are all the other playwrights of that era. And the world is kind of this, it's, it's modern, but it's as if Shakespeare never existed. And so like the predominant historical work of fiction that colors the world like Shakespeare does now is Chaucer, which is kind of fun. So there's like little tongue-in-cheek references to Chaucer. And then we did a spin-off series. So Ben Jonson was one of the contemporary playwrights that lived on after Shakespeare, and we gender bent that role and then did like a vlog style series. This was right around the time that the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, the vlog brothers, like Hank Green's series came out. And so I was really excited about the being able to tell stories through vlog, even though I had no experience doing that. And I hired a great team to do that. Like it was really like one writer, one director. And it was really, I mean, the actress that was playing Ben Jonson was amazing. And I'm really proud of it. It was definitely a product of my, like that time when I didn't really know what I was doing. And we all just basically grabbed a DSLR and made a story. But it's very cool to have finished that. And it exists on the internet should people want to find it. And I think the website still exists too, blankverse.tv. Have I given that up yet, Mike? I don't know. I feel like it still gets hosted somewhere with you.
As far as I know, it's still there.
I think it
Yeah.
still exists. Yeah. So blankverse.tv, and I mean obviously on YouTube as well. And it's yeah.
Yeah.
I'm excited. It's I'm proud of it. It is
Um
what it
s-
is.
so yeah, so there I think that counts as like your bona fides on that one where we are qualified to have this conversation. Um
Yes.
Now let's get into this actual movie itself. Um it is divisive to say the least. I think that there are a lot of people of our age that consider it to be um a masterpiece, a work of art. But I think that there are also a lot of people. I'd be really curious to get like a Gen Z take
I
on.
don't think they know it exists. Do they
I
know that this
well that
movie exists? I feel like it's way
I'm not
before.
sure, because for me it's gonna be one of those things that's gonna go either like it's gonna be absolutely polarizing, where they're gonna be like, this is all cringe, as they would say, or they would just like devour it, right? Um,
And
I
I do have to, as
yeah.
somebody coming into this, I do just want to be really clear. So, and again, like I love that my bona fides is like this web series I made and not my master's in theater degree that I that I spent many years studying. But I have to say that of Shakespeare's plays, Romeo and Juliet is not my favorite.
Yeah,
So, I think it makes this movie all the more qualified to be a perfect 10 because it's sort of in my mind that in spite of it being what I consider one of Shakespeare's least exciting plays, like, I really it's so
absolutely.
overdone, and so for me to say, "Yeah, let's talk about this as a perfect 10," is very interesting because so much of as you because you were saying, that's cringe about it is cringe because of the content as well as how it was made in this film,
Mhm.
which works so well together. Like this is the only play that could have been made like this, and it's such a product of its time, which is so ironic considering that it is an ancient play or like, hundreds of years old,
Yeah.
and it works so well. So sorry not to cut you off, but I did just want to sort of say that like I before we go into it, I want to say that the part that makes it brilliant is actually the part that makes it to me like kind of this weird texture of Shakespeare for me. But it's
Yeah.
so classic. I mean, I just went because I when we were doing this, I was like, oh, I should probably like watch it again. It's been a hot minute. So I didn't watch like the whole thing, but I like rewatched like main parts of it. And I'm like, I know this play. Like we studied this. Do they still have to
Yeah.
study this play in university or in high school? Because I feel like
I'm sure.
this is like intro to Shakespeare, is like
Yeah.
grade 8 or grade 9 Shakespeare is Romeo and Juliet because that's the age that you are, and that's like, oh, it's just, and watching it, you're like these little babies of like this like Claire Danes and Leonardo DiCaprio before he was Leonardo DiCaprio. Like,
Yeah, so
I'm so
the
excited to talk about this.
I think one of the most interesting things about this particular version is that the versions that predate it, right? I tend to be like pretty close to the source sort of stuff, and often age up. And I think that like prior to this movie, the conversation about Romeo and Juliet would always be like, well, you'd watch like the Zeffirelli Romeo and Juliet, which is what they would show you in school, because they're not going to show you this one. Um, and they're significantly older, right? Like
Yeah.
they're like mid 20s. So it's to me it doesn't, like, for me it doesn't work, right? Romeo and Juliet only works if they are, as even actually I think it works better if they're even younger than they are in this, but
Oh yeah.
I understand the reasoning for their ages in this. But I just to let everybody in on this, Leonardo DiCaprio was 21 and Claire Danes was 17 when they filmed this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
actually many of those scenes with her being 17 are actually like they are borderline inappropriate. And it's like if not just straight up, I don't know how puritanical we are these days, right? But like it is one of those things where it's like she is a minor, she is not an adult, and she's topless. I mean, like, we don't see her from the front or anything. It's all what you would consider tastefully shot. But it, like, as somebody who is a fan of film, who's gone to film school and understands production and being on set as you do, that means that there was a 17-year-old girl topless on set. Like
Mhm. Yeah.
that's and in an era where like it is not like it is today, where it would have been like, okay, like clear the set sort of thing. Like, I highly doubt that that was the case. I'd be really interested. I mean, I haven't really researched it specifically, I just rewatched it last night, and it was one of those things where it's like I was watching it and I was like, they are so young, how young were they? And then I looked it up
Yeah.
and was like, wow, she is so young in this. But it to me it works for the movie itself because it reinforces the like the foolishness of it, right? Because
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. We consider it a romance, but it's actually a tragedy, and it's actually like it it Romeo and Juliet are plot devices. They are not characters, and I think like that's where when you say like this, it's the least interesting of Shakespeare's plays, right? It's certainly up there, and it's because the like really the interesting characters in this are many of the supporting characters, and the interpretations in this version I think are actually the most interesting part of it. So one of those being there are two that sort of really jump out. One of those being Mercutio,
Oh,
and the way that they
yeah.
really Harold Perrineau really plays up the fact that Mercutio is in love with Romeo, right? Like that is there is the moment where it's sort of like called out, and it's like it's kind of between the lines, and it's kind of like you could kind of take it either way, but this interpretation really takes it in the direction of like like that is a thing, like he like Mercutio is like jumping in and getting involved because he is in love with Romeo. The other one that is a bit more of a leap, but that could be considered in the text depending on who you're talking to, is Juliet's mother being somehow romantically involved with Tybalt, right? Like
Oh,
that
oh, yeah.
like there is you have to really kind of pay attention to it in this movie, but it is there that like she loses it in a way that is like throw yourself on the casket sort of thing, where it's like you're like what's the relationship here with Juliet's cousin, right? Like it's odd, but it is also like it is subtextually there in this interpretation. So it's like I look at stuff like that and I go like, well, Baz Luhrmann was really like he was going like let's put something controversial into this. And then the funny part is that that is not I think what anybody ends up talking about when they talk about like like not controversy, but just sort of like the divisive aspects of this movie. So I think that people end up talking about like the guns and the soundtrack
Mhm.
and the stylization and stuff of like, well, it's, you know, it's sensationalizes it and whatever, and it gets away from the source material. And it's like, well, yeah, because it's the source material is hundreds of years old. So let's you know that we've seen it done vanilla a million times. Let's spice it up a little, you know. But it's funny to me because I find that those interpretations of Juliet's mother and Mercutio to be like really interesting takes. The Mercutio one I think is not as like you know overturning the apple cart. I think that there are a lot of people who would read that into it because of the scene with Tybalt, and like what gets said back and forth. Um but but yeah, like it to me it's funny that like that I Harold Perrineau's performance, like in the masquerade ball, and like the
Oh,
very
yeah.
obvious like drag send up aspect of it, which like listen, I watched this movie for the first time in 1997 when I would have been like 12 years old and did not understand why is this character like why is he dressed like a woman, what's going on, right? Like I but now when I watch it, being a much more evolved human being, I could just watch his scenes. Like honestly, like I think that Leo's performance is kind of it's kind of eh. But that Mercutio performance, along with John Leguizamo as Tybalt, is just like
Oh,
my God,
so
they
good.
like the two of them that because John Leguizamo is one of those actors that doesn't get credit for how talented he actually is, but but he delivers performances in a bunch of movies that are just like incredible, and this is one of them. I just like they're
He's so memorable. He is what I remember about this film.
Mhm.
Like, despite it having a stack cast, because I will say, I definitely forgot that Paul Rudd was Paris. Like, and it's so like he's so iconic. Like Paul Rudd is so Paul Rudd. Like knowing who he is now and like
Yeah,
rewatching this movie and being like the dance sequence is just so
yeah.
Paul Rudd being charming as heck, and you being like, oh my goodness, if he can't charm her, there's obviously anyways.
But such a
It's
dope,
beautiful
so
and
dopey.
he's such a I know he's so dopey and it's so lovely and he's delivers the lines like now's not a time for wooing, I guess. Like it's just such a like he just
Yeah.
but that and then but the only thing that I always remember about this movie besides Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes is John Leguizamo because
Mhm.
that role and what he did was so like, it was just so visceral, and also just because ever since then, I feel like I'm like, "Why do people just not want him in everything?" I mean, also, I mean in Moulin Rouge, he was quite lovely as well, I feel like. It's like Baz
Yeah.
Luhrmann's, like
I mean, like that he has this handful of performances that
mhm.
are um like unparalleled where you're like I can't imagine anybody else in this role. But then he's also what's the movie? It's The Pest, I think, is one of his starring vehicles. That is not a great movie. He is Clown in the Spawn film, and that's an
Oh,
awful movie.
interesting.
Spawn is one of those ones that like we could only do. Tyler and I could do a perfect 10 on it for April Fools because it is that bad. My God, that movie is so terrible. Um, but John Leguizamo every once in a while when given good material and I think like the room to move, he delivers incredible performances and this one is just so iconic. It's so iconic. I cannot imagine anybody else delivering at the caliber that he does in this, right? Like just because
And,
it's
like
it's tough. Like it's hard work what he has to do in this one.
oh, yeah. And I mean, I forgot too, because this was after To Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar, which is
Yeah.
also just a fantastic movie. And that he like his roles in the 90s were so great. And I feel like now people know him because of the like, he's in Ice Age or like I don't even know what it is that people know him from now. But
Yeah.
I'm like, man, if you haven't had a chance to see him in his prime, I feel like there's some great 90s movies that really like iconicized him, at least for me
Yeah.
in it.
Yeah. He is actually like one of my legit favorite actors, but it's one of those things where it's like it's got to be it has to be the right mix of things coming together, right? But yeah, he's so good in this. But then again, Harold Perrineau is just like he like leaps off the screen in the performance. Like
Oh
it's
yeah.
just it's so good. Um and like his death scene is fantastic. Even I with the very dated special effects and all of that, it's still for me. It still works so well. Um, yeah.
The thing that I find so interesting about this and not to like derail any conversations or whatever, but to get into like this movie also works as a product of the 90s.
Mhm.
Like the way like the communication and the like it's just sort of that like cusp of like cell phone call like there wasn't cell phones. There's not like really the ability to contact people, which is so important in Romeo and Juliet
Yeah.
that is just like it just work and it works because it's also modern enough like when people and again this is I love your initial take where you're like I want to know what Gen Z thinks of this movie because same for me. I feel like it's modern enough that it still works even with like modern day like, it just I feel like you could sort of do this movie again. It
Mhm.
obviously but it wouldn't be as iconic because there's something about the '90s in LA that is just so, like,
Yeah,
grunge or something that just fits this so well. I don't know.
it captures the year 1996 in such stark relief that
Yes.
it becomes a period piece, right? Like and for me I
Love
think
that.
that's why it does work. It's that like they when they made it it was contemporary, but they made it in a way because it was so stylized that it becomes period in the way that like when we now make a movie about the 1800s, right? It's like, oh well, we're gonna study all of these clothes and everybody's gonna be like so perfectly recreated. um that there's an artificiality to it, right? With a period piece that is like,
Yeah.
it's funny because they always win Academy Awards for it, and I'm always like, but there's nothing real about any of this. Like, this is all so heightened.
Right.
Because they'll take one aspect of culture at that point in time, and they will just like, that'll be the whole thing, right? um and that's what this does, like it and especially like you say, like that LA culture, which I think in the early to mid 90s, I think we were all very obsessed with. I don't think that it's the same now, certainly as it was then. Saved by the Bell and
Oh, yeah.
90210 and Melrose Place and all of that stuff. Like, you think about what pop culture was at the time. So like, we were obsessed with Southern California, right? As a culture. So this movie, setting itself in Verona Beach, was such a clever way of doing that, of putting you in a place and time, and then being able to play on that visual aesthetic, and have that back and forth, uh, uh, with that, and the interplay of that with the source material, right? Because I think like the um the way that they use like the news, like break-ins sort of thing, and as the narrator, and all of that, like it just it's I find it to be a very clever, if not a little bit like on the nose, interpretation. But to me, like, that's Baz Luhrmann. Like, I just, when I think of Baz Luhrmann stuff, it's like he subtlety is not is not his strong suit. um it is very much about being grandiose and in your face, and for me, like, that works. Like, I look at film. George Lucas said, about film, that like the whole thing is magic, the whole thing is an illusion, right? Like, it's it's we go to the movies and we want realism, but what you're paying for, the ticket, is all a trick of the eyes anyways, right? So like, he's always like leaned into that, because when it comes down to it, it's like a movie's not even a movie, it's just a series of still frames flashed in sequence
Right. Yeah.
that tricks us into believing that we're seeing motion, and it syncs up with sound, and it takes us away, and it's like, so like the whole process is magic. It's all, I mean, to be incredibly trite and ridiculous, it's the shadows on the cave wall, right? Like, we see what we want to see, and we follow it because we want to escape, right? So for me, like, when I think of film, that's how I think of it first and foremost. That's how I've always thought of it, since ever since I heard that sort of ideology from George Lucas. So realism is something that I find just so boring in film. It's like, like, I don't, what's real is like a camcorder, like handicap, like the Blair Witch Project is more realism than a Christopher Nolan film, right? Um, but but like, again, like, this is it. I don't think that that's the uh I don't think that that's like sort of the common, or like the general thought on film. I think that I think that that's very much, I don't know. I don't know if that is like along the lines of an avant-garde sort of way of looking at film, but it is definitely outside of the box of, I think, how most people interact with film when they go to the movie theater, right? Like, I mean, I argue with people about it all the time, right? Because they'll go to a Transformers movie and complain that it lacks realism, and I'll be like, you went to a Transformers movie. It's trucks that
Yeah.
turn into robots. Like, what do you expect? This happens all the time in like the discourse with Star Wars these days, and people wanting to talk about, like, oh, the like, oh, this show has such a low budget, and it's like, yeah, yeah, it's a TV show, and for being a TV show, I think that they actually do incredible stuff, right? But people, I think, lack that critical
Um,
thinking in that context so much.
And one of the things I love, and then not to like pull directly from Wikipedia, but in this case, I just feel like in contextualizing some
Mm,
stuff, I feel like one of the things that Baz Luhrmann, like the quote that's in here about like when he decided to do this, was that he was like, "How would Shakespeare make a movie?" And Shakespeare, I mean, you and I both know this because we studied Shakespeare, but Shakespeare was like lowest common denominator.
yeah.
And so like this quote from him is great. Like Baz Luhrmann is like, we know about the Elizabethan stage and that he was playing for 3,000 drunk punters from the sweet streepers to the queen of sweet street sweeper to the queen of England, and his competition was bear baiting and prostitution. So he was a relentless entertainer and a user of incredible devices and theatrical tricks to ultimately create something of meaning and convey a story. And that is what we wanted to do. And I just think exactly what you're talking about, where it's like, I don't know, I think that that comes across and makes it Shakespeare, which is
Yeah,
so, because I love that. Like, it's like, how do you show people, how do you get people to engage in something that they think is like distant from them? And I've been thinking about this recently, just about like the kind of media that I like and I like to consume. And there's like a really popular book series or book that just came out this year, and called Fourth Wing, and it's really sort of skewing, like, people either really like it or they are like kind of off put by it. And I really liked it, but one of the things, I was talking to somebody who's a fantasy reader who didn't like it, and they were like, "Yeah, it was too modern for me." And I'm like, "Oh my goodness, that is what I loved about it. That it was like this fantastical world, but they talked like I would talk to my friends, or like
yeah,
about the world and the way they conversed." And I feel like this inversion in Shakespeare is like they're taking this language that is so foreign and trying to place it in a way that is so familiar that it allows this like relationship to Shakespeare that I think is really missing. And one of my problems with so many modern adaptations of like Shakespeare, it does bother me sometimes when people do modern adaptations of Shakespeare, where they just try to be like, we're going to make this palatable for you and we're going to
mhm,
like show you, like take you along for the ride. And I'm like, no, no, it's still got to have that spectacle, and it's still got to like have all of the drama and the essence of what made Shakespeare Shakespeare. And I don't know. I think that this, of all of the things that you can do that are like modern, I really do like this
yeah.
take on it, because it's still keeping the language of and I don't know if any other translation of Shakespeare has done that, like any other modern, because I love purist Shakespeare. Like I will say the um Much Ado About Nothing with Emma Thompson and Benedict, what's his face? The guy that does everything.
Cumberbatch?
Um, no, not
Did you
Benedict
say? Oh,
Cumberbatch. I
sorry.
no,
Who?
I didn't. Who's the famous Shakespeare guy that does all the
Kenneth
plays?
Branagh? Is that what you're
Kenneth
talking about? Yeah.
Branagh.
Okay.
Yeah, I am. He played Benedict in
Okay.
Much
That's
Ado
what
About
you said.
Nothing. So
Benedict. I was like,
that's why I
Benedict
said
Cumberbatch
Benedict.
is not in that.
Yeah. No,
Um,
no, 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 no. But that he played Benedict, and like
yeah.
that, like I love me a purist Shakespeare like movie,
Yeah.
but the reason that that's not the thing we're talking about on Perfect 10 is because there's something so specific about this particular adaptation
Oh,
and our
yeah.
childhood that is just so seminal, and like I don't know. It's very
Listen,
exciting.
yeah, Kenneth Branagh's film adaptations of Shakespeare, of which there are several, they are what a scholar would consider the appropriate interpretations, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but but they are also, a scholar would consider it that way because they're gatekeepy. They're super
yeah.
gatekeepy, right? They're inaccessible.
Mhm.
They are not
Yeah,
like there's aside from having incredible casts because people want to work with him on these projects, right? Aside
yeah.
from that, there really isn't anything commercially viable about any of those projects, right? And moreover, like what Baz Luhrmann does in this movie that I think is commendable is that he uses contemporary context to color the text, right? So
Yeah.
they could be saying gibberish and you would still generally get the idea of what's happening in this film. um
Mm,
and
yeah. Mhm,
and
mhm.
and to me, like, that has always been And it was one of the things that I think we learned when we were doing Shakespeare Fest and that sort of thing, in doing the projects that we did for that, was that the words and the language, although they are important, and it is important when you're performing it to study that so that you understand what you're doing and what you're saying, it it actually is like the least important part. And it's so funny
Yeah.
because in English class, that's what we do, right? Is that we like study the words themselves,
Yeah.
so that we can learn, about historical context, and learning to read between the lines and understanding subtext and entendre and stuff like that, because Shakespeare was the master of all of that.
Yeah.
Um, but to truly experience Shakespeare is to see Shakespeare performed like passionately, right? Like that's
Mhm, mhm,
because
mhm.
that emotion is what comes through. And so it no different than opera, right? Where it's like you don't have to understand whatever language the opera is in, let's say Italian, right? In order to sit and enjoy an opera,
Yeah.
because the purpose of that medium is like we're gonna belt out these emotions to the cheap seats. Everybody in this theater is going to understand exactly what's happening, and the words aren't important. The emotion and the performance is what's important. And this movie gets that 95% of the time.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, 5% of that's missing is Leonardo DiCaprio as Romeo.
Yeah.
And I think that he was just put in there because like visually he works, but good gravy, his performance is so flat
Wait,
until the
sorry, who
end.
did you just say? Who did you
Leonardo
say?
DiCaprio,
Oh.
everybody else in this, I think, like delivers
But he was so
absolutely.
he I feel like he's one of the reasons that the film is made. Like, not so because I feel like before we, like, get too far
Yeah.
into, like, why, like, I know that there's, like, some let's have some facts about the film, and I, like, looking at stuff online before the podcast was that, like, I think that DiCaprio, like, flew himself down to
Yep.
Sydney to do some footage and all that stuff and, like, really wanted to make this, and the reason Claire Danes is in it is because he was like, "Well, let's hire this chick," because when she was auditioning, so, like, maybe he did get a bit more leeway probably than everybody else that was cast in it, because when you sort of have something, but I will say I don't know, I think he reacts quite well when he finds out that she's a Capulet. I liked that scene. I thought he did a good job.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
he has moments. He has moments. It's not a
yeah,
terrible performance. I just find it like when you compare it to
he's
everybody else in this, like when you put him up against Pete Postlethwaite, right? It's like, come on,
yeah.
there's no competition
Yeah.
here,
Well, of
right?
course, but he's also, and so this is one of the things, yes, because the opening scenes you're like, "Oh my goodness, what a whiny little baby."
Yeah,
And
yeah.
but that's how you're supposed to feel about Shakespeare or about Romeo.
About
Like,
Romeo, yeah.
specifically, like, Romeo's supposed to be kind of like pathetic and like not really like engaging. Like, I don't know, at least maybe this is just my biases against Romeo and Juliet, but like Romeo always rubs me the wrong way, and I'm kinda like, I'm like, "Run, Juliet, run!"
Yeah.
And it just, like, he's so, like, I don't know, like, even just the dialogue is so skeezy in the, like,
I
when
th-
he's,
yeah.
like, I don't know, their banter in
y-
the ball.
There is
It's
there is definitely a
hilarious.
component of it, because my interpretation, the way that I read Romeo and Juliet, is that Romeo is actually in reality a sleazeball, right? Like,
I was gonna say, a swear word boy, like,
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
can't,
yeah.
I don't think I can say the F word on the
No, no,
podcast, but,
we'll
like,
we'll we'll avoid that, but I think everybody knows exactly what you mean.
yes,
100%,
yes,
100%, right? Because the
yes,
the opening, his introduction is him pining over Rosaline, right?
yeah.
And then when he drops her, and even Father Lawrence is even like,
Just like,
"Excuse me?" Like,
yeah,
we're
weren't
like,
you just
yeah,
pining over this girl?
like
Like,
you were so enamored, like it's all you ever talk about, and then you meet this other girl, and now all of a sudden you want to marry her, like the next day, like literally the next day. I but to me, it's like, I think that aspect of it because in the text, the way it's written is that Romeo really is like manipulative, right? It's in the, it is right in it that Romeo is meant to be like an older 16 or 17, 18 years old, and Juliet's meant to be like 14 years old, right?
Yeah.
And it's all in that scene when they're talking about like her being wed, and it's like she's not even old enough, and it's like, oh, women
Right.
younger
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
her, right? Like that whole thing is when you look at the historical context, sort of places her at like 14 years old, right? It's like just
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
barely old enough to be married off. um
mm-hmm.
and so when you look at it with that lens, you the only way to interpret it is that here comes this beautiful boy Romeo, who any woman would throw themselves off a cliff for. He starts wooing this 14-year-old girl, and he absolutely knows exactly what he's doing with all of these things that he's saying to her, right?
Yeah.
But this interpretation plays their love so straight up, right? Like it is
Yeah.
just, it
It's
is
very
so,
earnest.
like, yeah, that to me, like that's that. And then at the very end of it, when they do both kill themselves, it just like it it actually is a little bit flat for me, because the only thing about it that I find redeeming in this interpretation is that like DiCaprio's Romeo is super selfish at the end, right? Like all of his actions after he kills Tybalt, like it's all now like about him, right? He like there's never anything about like what does this do to us. It's all just him. It's like, what is it, like my life is over, and then Juliet's dead, my like, oh, my love is gone. And he's like, he just, and the way that it's performed is very much like this sort of self-centered, I'm gonna go get poison, I'm gonna drink poison because I like, it's I have nothing left to live for. um and so that, like, that works for me a bit. But like that, those final scenes, as beautifully shot as it all is, because like I think like the production design and costumes and all of it, like it's all so visually stunning. But
Mm-hmm.
like the two of them, it's just kind of like to me, like this is sort of supposed to be the part where we really start to go like, oh no, like this whole thing was a mistake, this was all bad, right? He was better off with Rosaline, and she was better off with Paris, and and then none of this would have happened. um
Well, but you say that, and the scene that gets me in this that I don't get in the original, like in the like source text,
mhm,
is how distraught Juliet is, that she like going to, I guess, what is it? It's Friar Lawrence in the
mhm.
actual play, but like, and being like, I'm gonna kill myself if I can't be with Romeo.
Yeah,
And like, so like that, like I think Claire Danes does such a good, like that
totally.
scene of all the scenes is such a brilliant scene where he's just like talking her off the ledge and being like, well, if you're willing to die, why don't you try to pretend die? And it's just like, I don't know. So so for me also, I will always remember, because again, it's been ages since I watched this movie, but I remember her waking up as he kills himself. Like that's so, like, you're like just a second, like a hair's breadth away, and
Mhm.
it would have been okay, even though you know how it ends. And her cry, like like when she saw, like her sob after he dies, is so, I remember that so vividly from this, and just being like, she was such a perfect, but like it, I don't know. So that death scene,
Yeah.
I think it works because of her and because of the stakes in Juliet there for me a little bit, but also it's because I really don't care about Romeo just generally. Like I feel so bad. I feel so
Yeah.
bad. I was fact checking myself for some of this Baz Luhrmann stuff, and Natalie Portman was originally cast as Juliet, but she was 14, and they said that it was too. What is? I feel like the footage looked as if he was molesting her, so that's why she wasn't in the movie. My goodness.
Yeah,
So,
well,
well, yep,
yeah,
no doubt,
yeah.
no doubt. So,
Uh,
anyways, I will say 17 is probably an okay place to have netted out for the age difference there
it's
in the
I like that like earlier I'm like, I don't think that this was appropriate, and then you're like, well, it could have been a lot worse, and you're like,
Yeah,
okay, I guess we'll
yep,
take it. I
yep,
guess we'll
we'll
take it.
take it, we'll take
Beggars
it.
can't be choosers in this instance. Yeah, 14-year-old
Yep,
Natalie Portman would have been a different film. It would have been a
Oh,
different film.
oh,
I
very, very
think
much.
I think the subtext that I'm talking about would have been text.
Yeah, yeah,
It
not
would
so
not
much
have
so.
been
Not so
so
much
sub.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's funny. It's this is a funny thing because usually on Perfect 10 we're pretty effusive about stuff, and here I am being very critical. But I think like that is the Shakespeare nerd in me,
Of
is that
course.
like they're like to understand a Shakespeare nerd is to understand like me being critical of any interpretation of any Shakespeare that I see is because I actually love it.
You love it so much. Yeah.
I'm way into it, right? Um and I'm just
It's
trying to
also
flex and
it's
show
also
my
just how
nerdiness, you know.
you and I also just come at stuff. I feel like
Yeah.
whenever we talk about stuff we love, we always talk about the stuff that we hate first so that people understand why we love it. We're
Yeah.
like, we love it in spite of this stuff, you guys. In spite of this. This is
Yeah.
why it's awesome.
Yeah,
So,
I just think that from a pop culture standpoint, when people talk about this, they talk about I mean like the sort of iconic imagery of Leo in the night costume and her with her angel wings
oh
and
yeah.
all of that stuff, and it's like that stuff is fine, right? For me, like I think that it's all good. I think it's all well done in general, but like the way that this is remembered is is these heartthrobs, right? Romeo and Juliet, and to me that will always be walking away with the wrong message. Right? Is that like, oh,
Right.
they were so in love. It's I have to bring everything back to Star Wars always, right? I've already brought up George Lucas, but um when I watch the prequel trilogy and I see Anakin and Padme, speaking of Natalie Portman, um, doing their whole romantic thing, and everybody would be like, it's so like clunky and unnatural and weird, and I'm like, listen, I understand that this was not George's intent, but my personal interpretation of it, I think that he accidentally backed into. I mean, I think that George intentionally made the analogy to Romeo and Juliet, knowing that these characters are destined for tragedy, right? So, I mean, like it's actually right there in the movie because the love theme for Anakin and Padme in Attack of the Clones is called Across the Stars, which is it's a jumble of star-crossed, right?
Hmm.
That's why it's called Across the Stars. So for me, whenever I watch the prequels and I watch Anakin and Padme, and people will be like, "But they're supposed to be in love," I always go, "No, they're not. That's the point. That's actually the whole point. Is that they are both infatuated with the idea of one another, which is Romeo and Juliet, right? Is that like
Oh, interesting.
Anakin is obsessed with this vision of this girl that he met when he was 10 years old, right?
Right.
She was his, not to be, put too fine a point on it, but she was literally his sexual awakening at that age, right? Is that like
Yeah.
this older girl gives him all of this attention, was a surrogate mother to him in the moments after, right after he left his own mother, and then he was forced into this monk monastery situation where he had no parents. After tragedy, he just loses his mom, Qui-Gon dies, and like all of this stuff. So Anakin is ridiculously tragically traumatized, and he has like imprinted on Padme essentially, right? And so that's, he doesn't love her, he desires to possess her, right? And then Padme, it's so subtle, but it's there. She is in love with the idea of doing something wrong, of doing something bad. And she basically, when she gives her confession right before they think that they're about to die in the arena in Geonosis, she's like, I got like, listen, since you came back, like you're super hot. You're super hot, and I've just been thinking about kissing you the whole time. And you kissed me on Naboo, and I just can't stop thinking about that kiss because you're super hot. And this is so wrong. And I'm gonna get in so much trouble for it because you're a Jedi and I'm a senator. But like, I don't care, right? Like, we're gonna die, so like, I'm just gonna say all this stuff out loud. And then Anakin takes that as, oh, so you love me too, and it's like, that's not really. That's you guys are saying the word love, but it's not what you mean. And that's why they're destined for tragedy, right? Because if it were true love, then Anakin's actions in Revenge of the Sith would end up being different, right?
Right.
He would be selfless and not selfish, right? If he were truly motivated by love and not by attachment and possessiveness, right? So his actions there are like he dooms them and the entire galaxy by virtue of his inability to actually love. And then the thing that brings him back is the love of his son and his love for his son. And it's like, oh, he finally learns the lesson, right? So like that's all in there. And I just always like, whenever I think of Romeo and Juliet, and I can't help but going back to Attack of the Clones and thinking about all of that, and putting that lens on it. And it's one of those things where I go like, people misread the prequels so much because they want them to be the original trilogy, but they are actually Shakespearean, right? Like, it's all meant to be sort of Renaissance, epic, and tragedy and comedy and all of that stuff. That's why Jar Jar is the character that he is. If you look at Jar Jar with a Shakespearean lens, you're like, that character makes a lot more sense actually, because he's just a straight up clown, right? But
Yeah.
so as a Shakespeare nerd and a Star Wars nerd, these are the things that I think about when I watch stuff like this. But yeah, I I don't really know where to take it from that point. I do you have anything else that you wanted to add before we sort of wrap up? Because I think that we've kind of talked about everything
I know
that
we sort of mashed it all together,
yeah.
and I feel like one of the things is I'm curious, like, how many people listening to this have actually watched this, or how many people are going to watch it because of this.
Hmm.
Like, maybe
Hmm.
they've heard of it and like haven't actually gone into it. But I will say, like, for me, and why I've always been drawn to Shakespeare, and I know I've talked about this already on the podcast, but is that, like, I want people to know and understand that Shakespeare was writing for everybody. And
Hmm.
there's something about how this film is able to take that and realize it and hit, I think, something that's quite accessible, makes me hope that it gets people excited about Shakespeare. And every time I think about Shakespeare, I think about how this movie existed and nothing since has really done for Shakespeare what this movie did for Shakespeare, in my opinion. And
Totally.
I'm really excited and looking forward to, like, I always in my mind, I'm like, if we could do this again, what would be the equivalent to this? And there really isn't anything. So love it or hate it for Romeo and Juliet, the original source material. For me, that is what makes it such a, like, a perfect film, is because it takes something that is so iconic and so, some might say, inaccessible, or just like ephemeral, that is not quite understood, and can make it visceral and can make it relatable.
Hmm.
And if nothing else, it's kind of really interesting to watch Leonardo DiCaprio as a fresh-faced 20-year-old, and just sort of that, and just all of the talent that's in this film, and the I just the iconic iconography that I just remember is, anyways, I'm looking forward to anybody that hasn't seen it. It is on Disney Plus in Canada. I don't know where it is in the States. I feel like it's on Stars is where you can find it, but in, which is luckily in Canada, on, that means it's on Disney Plus. So very accessible now if you want to watch it. And yeah, just like such a great vehicle for those two actors. I mean, it's been wonderful to watch Claire Danes, like what she was able to do after that. And for me, thinking back to the 90s and just like pop culture that will forever resonate with me, I that's that's my submission for Perfect 10. And I mean, there could be other things, I will say. It ain't no Independence Day, but or Godzilla, the one from the 90s with Matthew Broderick. But it's very much very much in terms of the veins of the things that I love.
Yeah.
And as much as it is a tragedy, people also think it's one of the it could be romantic if you wanted to read it that way. Who am I to tell you that you're wrong? But as
Yeah.
somebody who heralds romance, I do love that this is in Wikipedia. It is like a romantic crime film, which I love. So I just think that's great. So if you want a good like romantic crime film in your life,
Yeah.
highly recommend checking out Baz Luhrmann's William Shakespeare's Romeo plus Juliet.
Yeah. Um that's great. It's so funny because you say since this one who has done basically like as much for Shakespeare as this film did, because I think that you're right that like it brought the idea of a modern retelling like this into sort of the pop culture spotlight. But the funny thing is that like this was basically followed up by a bunch of attempts to because this movie was hugely successful, and
Mhm.
I did like a pop culture moment, and the soundtrack went on to be like everybody had to have this soundtrack and all of that. And people were obsessed with Leonardo DiCaprio. I mean, like this ostensibly launched his career. Um, without this, does Titanic
Wasn't
become a
wasn't he
thing?
nominated for an Oscar for What's Eating Gilbert Grape?
Yeah,
I
yeah,
feel
but it's one of those things of like there's a difference
the child
between
actor Leonardo DiCaprio and the
yeah,
adult actor.
and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and like sort of like that like critical, oh my goodness, look how good, versus like the pop culture, like I don't think Leonardo DiCaprio becomes the institution that he becomes, for better or worse,
Yeah. Yeah.
without this performance, without this film, because this is the thing that cements him as like one of the guys, right? Like one of those guys of the 90s and early 2000s that's like this, cuz I think this leads right into Titanic, which then cements him as like one of the dreamiest dreamboats of the 90s, right? Um but I was just gonna say it's so funny because like we have the 1999 Midsummer Night's Dream with like Callista Flockhart and Kevin Kline and Michelle Pfeiffer, and
Oh
that
yeah.
just like
Oh,
is an
so good.
absolute flop. Like it
But
like
it's but I love it. But the problem with that is that it didn't modernize it enough. It
yeah.
sort of was like this interesting like half, because I will say it is kind of hard to do high fantasy like that and make it, oh man, there's just been so many, oh, oh. There's great, like there's, sorry, I could talk about Midsummer Night's Dream forever.
Yeah.
But yeah, it didn't do as well, but it should have. Come on, Stanley Tucci is just the
The
best.
cast is not a
The
problem, right?
best.
Yeah,
Yes.
but it just ends up kind of being, I think, very like 1999 blah. I
Yeah, yeah.
which I think everybody kind of gets what I mean when I say that. Here's my pitch for Midsummer Night's Dream. If you wanted to do for that what Baz Luhrmann did for Romeo and Juliet, he picked the Verona Beach setting, and I think that everything else kind of grows out of that. I think if you
Mhm.
want to make Midsummer Night's Dream something that would like really like captivate and capture people's imaginations, you can't do ancient Greece, and you can't do what they did, which was sort of like a early 1900s period thing.
Yeah.
You have to take the fantasy and you have to flip it and make it sci-fi. If you
Yeah,
made
yeah.
if you made it like a sci-fi visual spectacle that was also this story, I think that would be like something that would, yeah, I think that would like capture people. I think they'd be down for it. But yeah, I think it's just also a hard sell. I think that the language is such a barrier that what you have to do, what this movie captures, is you have to create a visual language to it that
Yeah.
that speaks louder than the words.
And you can't do that with the comedies because they're
Yeah,
meant to be more languid and more about the texture of the relationships and
yeah.
all of that stuff.
It is almost Romeo and Juliet's like sort of banal straightforwardness that
Yeah.
makes it the perfect vessel for like an interpretation like this, right? That it's just like
Mhm.
it's so blah that you can put
You
all of
can't
this other
help but,
stuff
like,
on
put
it.
whatever you want on it, and then
Yeah,
people can just read that.
yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and then
Very
as
much
long as
so.
people are kissing and fighting, right? Again, you talk about it
What
like
else do you need?
Shakespeare knew what he was doing, right?
Yep.
And like Romeo and Juliet, I think stands the test of time and is Shakespeare's most well-known work by
Mhm.
virtue of the fact that it is just fighting and effing. Like that's what it is. Like that's like
Yeah.
it's
Yep,
the two
that's what it
things that
is.
we want from like,
Yep,
blockbuster popcorn movies, right?
yep,
Um
yep.
it's like a romantic John Wick, right? Like there's there's more fighting. I think that there's more fighting like per scene, per page sort of thing in Romeo and Juliet than there is in really anything else Shakespeare. I'm hard
Oh,
pressed to think of
oh,
anything
yeah.
that's like quite as violent as it, because it is like the it is just the story, right? The plot is that the Capulets and Montagues are killing each
I
other in the
feel like
streets, right? Like
Titus
that's
Andronicus feels like it's
sure, yeah, sure.
potentially potentially
And
gives it
so
a run for its
like
money.
you can make an argument about some of like the historical stuff, right? Because you're talking
Yeah,
about like
the
but
literal
that's
war,
yeah,
yeah.
but that's like we don't actually see it. Whereas like Romeo and Juliet, like there are
It's just
multiple
fight,
sword fights, right?
wedding, fight, wedding. Oh, and the use of the I know that it's so but it's, like, kinda interesting, the use of the guns as,
Yeah,
like, with the names and the use of text in this as well is so interesting, like, in the production design as well, like,
yeah,
all of the, like, little pieces of beautiful, like, homage peppered in, which is so fantastic, like homage to Shakespeare, so
yeah. It's
ugh, I
definitely
don't know.
it
Talk
it
so much about it.
it's I don't know. I think it's hard to not do Shakespeare in a way that ends up being a bit cringe. And I think that what you have to
Yeah.
do is you have to embrace that cringe. You have to lean into it. And you have to live inside it. Like and this movie does that for better or worse. It absolutely does that. So I love it. Um I love so much about it, but like for me, I could just watch that the Mercutio Tybalt scene on repeat for hours because there's just so much in that to dig into in those two performances, like those guys on screen together. It's just so good. But I'll give it to Leo in that scene because his like reluctance to fight in
Oh, it's
all of
so good.
that,
Yeah.
I think is
He
really good.
does
Where
such a good
he's
job.
like I don't like you get it like, and that's complex. Like that is like
Mhm,
that's a
mhm.
meaty moment to like to really sink your teeth into as an actor. Um, is this idea that you're trying to get across? Like I can't tell you that you're now my family, right? Because that's what's going on there. Is he's like I won't fight you because like you don't
Yeah,
understand this and you can't
but I
understand
love
this,
you, yeah.
but yeah, like I love her, therefore I love you. Like I love everything about her and she's a Capulet, which means that I love all Capulets, right? Like and that comes across in his performance. So I'll give him that scene for sure. That whole sequence is just, I think, is just so well done. But um yeah, awesome. Well, there it is. I think we've done it. I
I think so too.
Amanda, thank you for jumping on. Thank you for
Of
being on
course.
Perfect 10 finally, for coming out of podcast retirement to talk about
For
this with
one
me.
and only night, yeah. All
Yeah.
you gotta do is say, "We can talk about whatever you want." That was literally
Yeah.
and I'm like, "Yay, alright, sounds good. Works for
Um
me."
yeah. Awesome. Well, that's it. That's another nerdy conversation in the books. Thanks for listening to ThunderQuack Perfect 10. If you found joy in today's discussion, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast service, leave a rating and review. And if you want to chat about today's episode, you can head over to our Discord at thunderquack.com/Discord. Your comments might be used in a future episode if you do that. And for those looking to keep the fun alive and help us continue doing what we love, show us some support over at patreon.com/thunderquack. And until next time, remember, it's not about the score, it's about the love. Stay geeky, everyone. ThunderQuack Perfect 10 is hosted by me, Michael Cohen. Follow us on Twitter at ThunderQuackPod, on Instagram at ThunderQuackPodcast, on Facebook at ThunderQuack, and join us on Discord at thunderquack.com/Discord. Support the podcast by heading to patreon.com/ThunderQuack to get early access, bonus episodes, and the ThunderQuack Perfect 10 Pop Quiz. ThunderQuack Perfect 10 is part of the ThunderQuack Podcast Network. Thanks for listening.